I thought I knew what heartbreak felt like. I was wrong. There I sat, Maya Lynn, 29 years old, watching my father carve up his empire. My brothers got millions of dollars each. And me, the daughter who'd loved him most, who'd been good and loyal her entire life, I got a cemetery. A broken-down, weed-choked cemetery I couldn't afford to maintain. My stepmother actually laughed. Victor left Maya a cemetery? But when I drove through the rain to see my worthless inheritance, I found something hidden in the graves that changed everything. A secret my dad had been desperate for me to discover. A truth that would turn my entire world upside down. I'm Maya, and this is how I discovered that sometimes the most powerful inheritance has nothing to do with money.
Chapter 1. The Will and the Weeds. The mahogany conference table stretched longer than my childhood dining room, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the gray November sky, pressing against the 42nd floor windows. I sat there, Maya Lynn, 29 years old, and feeling like I was still the awkward teenager who never quite fit at family dinners, watching my father's legacy get carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey. Daniel Lynn, the lawyer's voice, carried that particular blend of gravity and efficiency that comes with charging $800 an hour, inherits the Meridian Tower office complex on Fifth Avenue, comprising 43 floors of prime Manhattan real estate, currently valued at approximately $68 million. My oldest brother straightened his already perfect posture. At 35, Daniel had inherited more than Dad's broad shoulders and steel gray eyes. He'd gotten the same ruthless focus that had built our family's construction empire from nothing. He nodded once, accepting his golden ticket with the same expression he'd worn when accepting his Harvard law diploma. Expected. Deserved. Natural. Eric Lynn, the lawyer continued, inherits the Westchester Medical Plaza, including the adjacent luxury condominium development, valued at approximately $42 million. Eric, 33, a plastic surgeon with hands so steady they could rebuild a face and an ego large enough to fill Madison Square Garden, smiled that practiced smile he'd perfected for nervous patients. Of course, he'd get the medical properties. Dad always said Eric could make anyone feel beautiful, even if they were paying him 6 figures for the privilege. I found myself studying the rain streaking down the windows, counting droplets the way I used to count ceiling tiles during family meetings I was too young to understand, but old enough to sense I didn't belong in. The city looked gray and blurred through the water, like an impressionist painting of loneliness. And Maya Lynn. I turned back to the table, where 5 faces, Daniel, Eric, my stepmother Elaine, the lawyer and his assistant, all looked at me with expressions ranging from polite interest to barely concealed pity. Even at 29, I was still the baby, still the afterthought, still the daughter who chose freelance journalism over joining the family business. Maya Lynn inherits the property at 2847 Cemetery Road, Greene County, New York, comprising 14 acres of undeveloped land currently designated as Hillcrest Memorial Gardens, along with the associated monthly maintenance obligations. Silence settled over the room like dust. I felt heat creep up my neck. Not embarrassment exactly, but something closer to that hollow feeling you get when you're the last one picked for teams in gym class. Except this time, the stakes were my father's final judgment of my worth. A cemetery? Elaine's voice carried that particular note of disbelief she'd perfected during her 8 years as my stepmother. At 52, she'd maintained that kind of blonde elegance that required significant monthly investment, and she wielded her disappointment like a scalpel. Victor left Maya a cemetery? An abandoned cemetery, Daniel clarified, because he'd never met a situation he couldn't make slightly worse with additional information. I drove past it once, haven't seen a fresh burial there in decades, just weeds and broken headstones. Plus the maintenance costs, Eric added helpfully. What did the lawyer say? $4,000 a month just to keep it from being condemned? I stared down at the inheritance documents, at my father's signature bold in black across the bottom of the page. Victor Lynn, the man who'd built skyscrapers, who transformed abandoned lots into luxury developments, who'd never met a piece of real estate he couldn't turn into gold, had left me 14 acres of dead people and weeds. There must be some mistake, Elaine said, reaching across the table toward the papers. Maya should get something equal, something fair. Victor wouldn't have— The will is quite clear, the lawyer interrupted gently. Mr. Lynn spent considerable time with these arrangements. Each bequest was specifically chosen and deliberately assigned. Deliberately? The word sat in my chest like a stone. Dad had deliberately given Daniel the crown jewel, deliberately given Eric the medical empire, and deliberately stuck me with a cemetery I couldn't afford to maintain and couldn't sell because who wants to buy an abandoned graveyard? I thought about all those Sunday dinners, growing up sitting at the far end of the table while Dad discussed business with my brothers. Daniel would share law school stories, Eric would talk about his medical residency, and I'd mention a story I was working on, only to watch Dad's attention drift to his phone or the window or anywhere but me. Even when I'd won that journalism award last year, a real award from the New York Press Association, he'd managed to turn the conversation to Daniel's latest corporate merger within 5 minutes. Maya, Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. Are you okay with this? The question hung in the air, loaded with subtext. Are you going to make a scene? Are you going to contest this? Are you going to be the difficult one as usual? I looked around the table at their faces. Daniel's carefully neutral expression, Eric's barely concealed relief that his inheritance was secure, Elaine's sympathetic frown that didn't quite reach her eyes. These people had been my family for 29 years, and in this moment, I felt more distant from them than the cemetery Dad had somehow thought appropriate to dump on me. I'm fine, I said, gathering the papers with hands that only shook slightly. I should go see what I've inherited. I stood, smoothing my black dress, the same one I'd worn to Dad's funeral 3 weeks ago. Through the window, the November sky was darkening, and I could see rain beginning to fall harder against the glass. Maya? Wait, Elaine called as I reached the door. We could help you figure out what to do with it. Maybe we could all— Thank you, I said, not turning around. But I think I need to see it first, alone. I walked out of that gleaming office tower, past the marble lobby and the uniformed doorman, into the cold New York rain. I was going to drive north to Greene County, to a cemetery I'd never seen, carrying papers that proved what I'd always suspected, that even in death my father still didn't quite know what to do with me. But as I walked to my car, rain soaking through my jacket, I felt something I hadn't expected. Underneath the hurt and confusion, there was a tiny spark of curiosity. Why a cemetery? Why that cemetery? And why did the lawyer's words keep echoing in my head? Deliberately chosen and deliberately assigned. Dad had never done anything without a reason. Maybe it was time I found out what this one was.
Chapter 2. The Black Stone That Drinks Rain. The drive north from Manhattan to Greene County should have taken 2 hours, but I stretched it to 3, stopping twice for coffee I didn't want and once to sit in a rest area parking lot, staring at the inheritance papers until the words blurred together. 2847 Cemetery Road, Hillcrest Memorial Gardens. Monthly maintenance,
$4,200. I kept thinking about Dad's hands, those broad, calloused hands that had laid the first brick of every building he'd ever constructed. Even after he became successful enough to hire armies of workers, he'd still show up at job sites, still run his fingers along fresh mortar, still check every corner for imperfections. Those hands had signed the will that left me a cemetery. There had to be more to it. The rain followed me north, turning from city drizzle into proper country downpour. By the time I found Cemetery Road, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that wound between overgrown fields, my windshield wipers were working overtime, and I could barely make out the rusted iron gates that marked the entrance to what was apparently mine now. I pulled through the gates and immediately understood why Daniel had called it abandoned. The gravel drive was more weeds than stone, pocked with puddles that reflected the gray sky like scattered mirrors. Ancient oak trees, their branches heavy with November's last stubborn leaves, created a canopy so thick that even in daylight, the place felt wrapped in twilight. But it wasn't the overgrown paths or the tilting headstones that made me catch my breath. It was the silence. In the city, silence is something you pay extra for. Soundproof apartments, noise-canceling headphones, meditation apps that promise to quiet the chaos in your head. Here, silence was a living thing, broken only by the whisper of rain on leaves and the distant murmur of water running somewhere I couldn't see. I parked beside what might have once been a maintenance shed and stepped out into the rain. The air smelled like wet earth and something else, something clean and green that I'd forgotten existed. I'd grown up in Manhattan apartments with climate control and sealed windows. I'd forgotten that air could have texture, could make you want to breathe deeper just for the pleasure of it. The cemetery stretched before me in gentle slopes and hidden corners, marked by headstones that ranged from simple granite slabs to elaborate Victorian monuments. Some were so old their inscriptions had worn away, leaving only shadows of lives once celebrated. Others leaned at angles that suggested the earth beneath them had shifted and settled, the way grief does over time. But there was one monument that commanded attention even in the gray light, a massive headstone of black marble that seemed to absorb the rain rather than simply getting wet. Unlike the weathered stones around it, this one gleamed, its surface so dark and polished it looked like a pool of still water standing upright. I walked toward it, my heels sinking into the soft earth, rain plastering my hair to my head. As I got closer, I could make out the inscription carved deep into the stone. James Lynn, 1924 to 1987, beloved father and builder of dreams. My grandfather. Dad's father, whom I'd never met. He died when I was 2, but Dad had talked about him sometimes, always with a mixture of pride and something that might have been regret. Your grandfather could make something beautiful out of nothing, he'd say. He saw possibilities where other people saw problems. Standing there, in the rain, looking at this monument that someone, Dad, had kept in perfect condition while letting the rest of the cemetery fall into gentle decay, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about inheritance or fairness or family dynamics. This was about memory, about keeping something sacred alive. Miss Lynn. I spun around, startled by the quiet voice. An elderly Asian man stood about 10 feet away, wearing a rain slicker that had seen better decades and holding an umbrella that might have been older than me. He was small and compact, with silver hair and eyes that held the kind of calm that comes from spending decades in quiet places. "I'm sorry," he said, bowing slightly. "I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Mr. Han. I've been looking after the place." "Looking after it?" I gestured at the overgrown paths, the tilting headstones. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. The lawyer said—" "The lawyer knows about contracts and monthly payments," Mr. Han said gently. "He doesn't know about the rest of it. Your father, he came here every month, always on rainy days. Said some things are meant to be seen wet." I stared at him, rain dripping from my nose. "Your father?" Came here? Dad came here? Every month for 27 years, Mr. Hahn confirmed. Since right after you were born, he'd stand right where you're standing now, looking at his father's stone. Sometimes he'd talk to it. Sometimes he'd just stand there and let the rain wash over him. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Dad, who lived his life in boardrooms and construction sites, who measured success in square footage and profit margins, had been coming to this quiet place for my entire life, coming here to stand in the rain and talk to his father's grave? He left these for you, Mr. Hahn said, pulling a small ring of keys from his pocket. Said when the youngest daughter came, I should give them to her. Said you'd know what to do with them when the time was right. I took the keys with shaking hands. They were old, brass, worn smooth by decades of use. One looked like it might fit a door, another was smaller, more delicate. The third was unlike anything I'd ever seen, an intricate piece that looked more like jewelry than key. What did they open? I asked. Mr. Hahn smiled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the expression reached his eyes. Your father said you'd figure that out. Said you were the one who saw things others missed, who asked the right questions even when they led to uncomfortable answers. The rain was falling harder now, turning the day darker, but somehow I didn't feel cold. I looked back at my grandfather's monument, at that black marble that seemed to drink the rain, and I understood something I hadn't before. Dad hadn't left me a burden. He'd left me a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally left me something that was meant just for me.
Chapter 3. Letters that appear in water. I should have driven back to the city that evening, should have found a hotel room, ordered room service, and tried to make sense of what Mr. Hahn had told me over a glass of wine and the kind of mindless television that helps you forget complicated days. Instead, I found myself sitting in my car in the cemetery parking area as darkness fell, staring at those 3 brass keys and listening to the rain drum against my roof. Mr. Hahn had disappeared as quietly as he'd appeared, melting back into the shadows between the headstones like he'd been part of the landscape all along. But his words kept circling in my mind. Some things are meant to be seen wet. What kind of things? And why would Dad, who lived his entire life in climate-controlled environments, choose to come here only when it rained? The rational part of my brain, the part that had earned me a journalism degree and taught me to question everything, said I was reading too much into an old man's cryptic comments. Dad had probably just found peace in this quiet place, and the rain timing was coincidence. People grieved in strange ways. But the other part of my brain, the part that had always noticed when Mom changed the subject too quickly or when Dad's stories about his childhood didn't quite add up, that part was practically humming with anticipation. I'd learned long ago to trust that feeling, even when it led me places I didn't expect to go. The rain intensified as I sat there, shifting from steady downpour to the kind of heavy, driving rain that turns the world into a watercolor painting. Through my windshield, I could just make out the dark bulk of my grandfather's monument, that black marble headstone that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed the small flashlight from my glove compartment and stepped back out into the storm. The rain hit me like a cold slap, soaking through my jacket within seconds and turning the cemetery paths into streams of mud and fallen leaves. I should have been miserable, should have been cursing my impractical shoes and my stubborn curiosity. Instead, I felt strangely alive, like I was finally moving towards something instead of away from it. I made my way back to my grandfather's headstone, my flashlight beam dancing across the wet ground. Up close, the monument was even more impressive, easily 8 feet tall and carved from a single piece of marble so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The inscription on the front was exactly as I'd read it before: James Lynn, 1924 to 1987, beloved father and builder of dreams. But as I walked around to examine the stone from different angles, something made me pause. The back of the monument, the side that faced away from the main cemetery path, looked different somehow. Not damaged or weathered, but expectant, like it was waiting for something. I ran my hand across the surface, surprised by how smooth it felt despite the rain. The marble was so perfectly polished that water didn't bead on it. Instead, it seemed to sink in slightly, creating a thin film that made the stone look almost liquid in my flashlight beam. And then I saw them. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by my flashlight moving across the wet surface. But as I held the beam steady and let the rain sheet across the marble, faint characters began to appear from within the stone itself, like invisible ink responding to water. My hands shook as I traced the letters with my fingertip. They were carved so shallow they were invisible when dry, but the rain filled them just enough to catch the light. It was a message, written in Dad's careful handwriting. For the daughter who sees what others miss, 10 paces north from this stone, under the big stone that stands alone. When you're ready to know the truth about where you come from, bring what you find to the place where memory meets legacy. But tell no one yet, little bird. Some secrets choose their own time to fly. Your father, who finally understood what his father was trying to teach him. My heart hammered against my ribs. Little bird. Dad hadn't called me that since I was 7 years old, since the day he found me crying in Central Park because I'd gotten separated from our family during a picnic. Don't worry, little bird, he'd said, scooping me up in those strong arms. You were never lost. You just flew ahead to scout the path. I read the message 3 more times, memorizing every word as the rain continued to reveal and re-reveal the hidden text. Then I turned north, counting steps on shaking legs. 1, 2, 3. The ground was soft under my feet, muddy and treacherous. 5, 6, 7. I could see another headstone ahead, standing by itself under a massive oak tree. 8, 9, 10. The solitary headstone was smaller than my grandfather's monument, but still substantial, a granite marker that had weathered decades of storms. I knelt beside it, not caring that my knees were sinking into the muddy earth, and began to clear away the wet leaves and debris that had accumulated around its base. Emma Chen, 1952 to 1981, beloved sister and mother. Her light lives on in those she loved. I sat back on my heels staring at the name. Emma Chen, not Emma Lynn, Chen. A sister who had died when she was only 29 years old, my age. And the dates. If she'd been Dad's sister, she would have died just before I was born. My flashlight beam swept across the base of the headstone, and there, partially hidden by decades of soil and fallen leaves, I could see the corner of something that didn't belong. Something rectangular and artificial, buried shallow in the earth beside the grave. I dug with my bare hands, rain streaming down my face, my fingers numb with cold and anticipation. The object was wrapped in multiple layers of heavy plastic, sealed with tape that had somehow survived 30 years of weather. Inside the waterproof wrapping, I found a metal box, about the size of a jewelry case with 3 small locks built into its lid. 3 locks. 3 keys. I fumbled for the brass keys Mr. Han had given me, my hands shaking so hard I could barely fit them into the tiny keyholes. The first key turned with a soft click. The second required more coaxing, the mechanism stiff with age, but finally gave way. The third key, the ornate one that looked like jewelry, slid home like it had been waiting decades for this moment. The box opened with a whisper of old air, revealing its contents in the dancing beam of my flashlight, a thick manila envelope sealed with wax, and beneath it, a smaller envelope with my name written across it in Dad's careful script. I sat there in the rain holding 30 years of hidden truth in my muddy hands and realized that everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, about why Dad had left me this place, was about to change forever. The rain was washing away more than just the day's accumulated dust and grime. It was washing away the life I thought I'd been living, preparing me for whatever truth Dad had kept buried alongside his sister's grave for all these years. Chapter 4. The Vault and the Unearned Empire. I drove back to the city that night in a daze, the metal box on my passenger seat like a ticking bomb. Every red light gave me another chance to stare at it, to wonder if I really wanted to open those envelopes and learn whatever truth had been important enough for Dad to orchestrate this elaborate treasure hunt from beyond the graves. By the time I reached my Brooklyn apartment, it was past midnight, and my hands had finally stopped shaking. I made coffee I didn't need, changed into dry clothes, and sat at my small kitchen table with the box between my hands and my courage. The envelope with my name opened easily, revealing a single sheet of paper in Dad's careful handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. Maya, if you're reading this, you found what I could never bring myself to show you while I was alive. I've spent 29 years being a coward, telling myself I was protecting you from a truth that might hurt more than the lies. But sitting here in the oncologist's office, listening to him explain how much time I probably have left, I realized that the greatest injury I could do you would be to leave you believing you were somehow less worthy than your brothers, somehow less deserving of my love and trust. You were never my daughter, little bird. You were something far more precious. You were my sister's daughter, and my promise to her, and my chance to do something right after I'd done so much wrong. The larger envelope contains documents that will explain everything I don't have the courage to tell you face to face. When you've read them, you'll understand why I left you the cemetery, why I left you the legacy I did, and why you were always the child I trusted most, even when I was too afraid to show it. There's an address at the bottom of this letter. When you're ready, and only when you're ready, go there. Use the ornate key. Inside, you'll find what really belongs to you, what always belonged to you. I love you more than all the buildings I ever built, little bird. I just wish I'd been brave enough to show you sooner. Dad. The address was in Midtown Manhattan, a few blocks from the law office where I'd learned about my inheritance. I recognized the street, one of those quiet, expensive blocks where old money kept its secrets behind unmarked doors and bulletproof glass. The envelope was thicker, heavier, sealed with red wax that had somehow survived 30 decades. Inside, I found documents that made my carefully ordered world tilt sideways and keep spinning. Death certificates. Emma Chen Lin and Robert Chen, killed in a car accident on the West Side Highway on February 15, 1981. Survivors, one daughter, Maya Chen, age 6 months. Insurance documents, a policy worth $300,000, an enormous sum in 1981, paid out to the child's legal guardian, Victor Lin, Emma's older brother. Legal papers. Adoption records showing how Victor had legally changed my name from Maya Chen to Maya Lin, how he'd moved me into his household, how he'd used the insurance money as seed capital for his first major development project. Financial records. A detailed accounting of how that initial $300,000 had grown over the years through Victor's investments and developments, how he'd kept meticulous track of what belonged to the Emma inheritance versus his own earnings, how he'd been setting aside money for 29 years that he considered mine by right. And photos. God, the photos. Pictures of a young woman who looked like me if I looked in the mirror 10 years from now. The same dark hair, the same serious eyes, that smile that never quite reached those eyes. Emma, holding a baby that must have been me, standing beside a man with kind eyes and gentle hands who must have been my father, my real father, Robert Chen. I sat there at my kitchen table until dawn, reading and rereading, trying to absorb the magnitude of what Dad, what Victor, had hidden from me. I wasn't his youngest daughter. I was his niece, orphaned as a baby,
raised by a man whose guilt over his sister's death had shaped every decision he'd made about my life. No wonder I'd never quite fit with Daniel and Eric. No wonder family dinners had always felt like performances where I didn't know my lines. I'd been playing the wrong role in the wrong story for 29 years. But underneath the shock and confusion, something else was growing, a strange kind of relief. All those years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, wasn't achieving enough, wasn't living up to some impossible standard. It hadn't been about me at all. It had been about Victor's guilt, his need to honor a sister he'd lost, his fear that anything he gave me would never be enough to make up for what I'd lost before I was old enough to remember losing it. At 8 o'clock that morning, I called in sick to the magazine where I was supposed to be interviewing a city councilman about housing policy. Instead, I took the subway into Manhattan, to the address at the bottom of Dad's letter. The building was exactly what I'd expected. Understated, expensive, the kind of place where serious people handled serious money. The directory in the lobby listed only suite numbers, no company names. I took the elevator to the 15th floor and found Suite 1507, marked only with a small brass nameplate, Private Client Services. The ornate key fit perfectly into an almost invisible lock beside the door. Inside, I found myself in a small, elegantly appointed waiting room that looked like it belonged in a Swiss bank. A woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed and utterly serene, looked up from her desk as I entered. "Miss Lynn," she said, as if she'd been expecting me for years. "Please, come in. Your father left very specific instructions." She led me through another door into what could only be described as a vault, walls lined with safety deposit boxes, each one numbered and locked. She went directly to box 2847, the same number as the cemetery's address, and inserted a key from a chain around her neck. "He said you'd come when you're ready, and that when you did, I should tell you that he was proud of the woman you became and sorry it took him so long to trust you with the truth." Inside the box, I found more than I could imagined. Cash, nearly $50,000 in neat stacks. Stock certificates worth another $600,000, and most stunning of all, property deeds. 20 parcels of land scattered across Greene County, all surrounding the cemetery where I'd stood in the rain just 12 hours earlier. Together, those parcels controlled the water rights, road access, and development potential for nearly 2,000 acres of prime rural real estate. The cemetery wasn't worthless land burdened with maintenance costs. It was the keystone of an empire worth millions, carefully assembled over decades and held in trust for the daughter who would someday understand its true value. I sat there in that vault, surrounded by the evidence of Victor's secret devotion, and finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me with his final gift. I wasn't his greatest failure. I was his most precious responsibility, the living legacy of the sister he'd failed to save, the child he'd spent his entire adult life trying to make whole. The cemetery wasn't a burden. It was a kingdom, and I was its queen.
Chapter 5. Family Circles the Grave. I spent the next 3 days in a strange kind of suspended animation, carrying the weight of Victor's secret like a stone in my chest. I went through the motions of my normal life, interviewing sources, writing articles, meeting friends for coffee, but everything felt distant and surreal, like I was watching someone else's life through thick glass. The hardest part wasn't the magnitude of what I'd inherited. It was the loneliness of knowing something that would change everything and not being able to share it with anyone. Victor's letter had been clear: tell no one yet. But he hadn't explained how long I was supposed to keep his secret, or what signal I should wait for before revealing the truth. On Thursday evening, that signal arrived in the form of Daniel's voice on my answering machine. Maya, it's your brother. Listen, Elaine and I have been talking, and we think you could use some help managing your situation. Why don't you come to dinner Sunday? We want to discuss some options that might work better for everyone involved. His tone was carefully neutral, the way he spoke to clients he was about to deliver bad news to. I played the message 3 times, hearing the subtext he wasn't quite saying out loud. They'd been discussing my situation, my worthless inheritance and monthly maintenance bills, and they'd come up with a solution that would work better for everyone, meaning it would work better for them. I called him back immediately. Daniel, it's Maya. I got your message. Oh, good. So you'll come Sunday, around 6? Elaine's making that roast you like. I'll be there. But can I ask what kind of options you want to discuss? A pause. Well, we've been thinking about the practical aspects of your inheritance, the maintenance costs, the remote location, the limited market appeal. There might be ways to restructure things, make it more manageable for you. Restructure how? We'll talk about it Sunday. Don't worry, Maya. We're family. We'll figure something out. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. The particular kind of rage that comes from being underestimated by people who should know better. They thought I was drowning, and they were planning to throw me a rope that came with strings attached. Friday brought another message, this one from Eric. Hey sis, probably Daniel told you about Sunday dinner. I just wanted to say, don't feel like you have to carry this burden alone. We've got some ideas that could really help you out. There's a guy I know, a developer, who specializes in challenging properties. Really creative problem solver. I think you'll like him. A developer who specialized in challenging properties. How thoughtful of Eric to already have someone in mind. But it was Mr. Hahn's call on Saturday morning that told me just how quickly things were moving. Mr. Maya, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the papers your father left. Of course, Mr. Hahn. Is everything all right? Well, that depends. Yesterday, there were some men here, suits and clipboards, taking pictures, measuring things. They said they were just doing a survey, but he paused, and I could hear the concern in his voice. They spent a lot of time looking at the access road, asking about utilities, checking property lines. They drove a very expensive car for people just doing a survey. My stomach dropped. Did they give you any names? Any business cards? One of them did, said to call him if I had any questions about development opportunities in the area. I thought you should know. After Mr. Hahn read me the name and phone number, I did a quick internet search that confirmed my suspicions. The man was exactly what Eric had described, a developer who specialized in buying distressed properties, usually at far below market value, and turning them into profitable ventures, sanction centers, housing developments, the kind of projects that turned quiet rural areas into busy commercial districts.
They'd already made contact with a buyer before Sunday dinner, before their helpful family meeting, before they'd even told me what their options were. I spent Saturday afternoon driving back up to Greene County, not to the cemetery this time, but to explore the 20 parcels of land I now knew belonged to me. Armed with the property maps from Victor's vault, I drove the back roads and walked the boundaries, seeing the landscape with new eyes. What I found was breathtaking in its scope and strategic brilliance. Victor hadn't just bought random pieces of land, he'd assembled a master plan,
The parcels controlled every major watershed in the area, every access road that could handle heavy traffic, every high point that offered valley views. Together, they formed a protective ring around some of the most beautiful countryside I'd ever seen. Standing on a hilltop that overlooked the cemetery and the valley beyond, I could imagine what a developer would see. Hundreds of luxury homes, shopping centers, maybe even a resort. Million-dollar views, convenient access to the city, the kind of development that would make someone very, very rich. And I could imagine what Victor had seen. His sister's final resting place surrounded by rolling hills and old trees, protected forever from the kind of aggressive development that had made his fortune, but also perhaps cost him his peace of mind. As I stood there in the late afternoon light, my phone rang. Elaine. "Maya, dear, I hope you're looking forward to tomorrow night. I wanted to ask, would it be all right if we invited a guest, someone Daniel and Eric think you should meet, a very nice man who might be able to help with your property challenges?" "Of course," I said, watching a hawk circle over the valley below. "I'd love to meet him." "Wonderful. His name is Robert Morrison. He's a developer with a lot of experience in rural properties. Very creative problem solver, Eric says." After I hung up, I laughed out loud, the first time I'd laughed since finding Victor's letters. They thought they were being so clever, so helpful. They thought I was a drowning woman who would grab any rope they threw me, even if it came with a noose attached. They had no idea that I wasn't drowning at all. I was just learning how to swim in deeper waters than they'd ever imagined. Sunday dinner was going to be very interesting, especially when they realized that the helpless little sister they were planning to rescue had become someone else entirely, someone who knew exactly what her kingdom was worth and exactly what it would cost them to try to take it away from her. I drove back to the city that evening with my windows down, breathing in the autumn air and feeling something I hadn't felt since childhood, the fierce joy of knowing a secret that was going to change everything.
Chapter 6. The Unmasking Rain. Sunday arrived gray and restless, with the kind of heavy clouds that promised a storm before evening. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple black dress that looked appropriately grateful and overwhelmed, paired with the pearl earrings Victor had given me for my college graduation. I wanted to look like the Maya they expected, slightly lost, definitely in over her head, ready to accept whatever help her loving family offered. By 5:30, I was standing outside Daniel's Upper East Side townhouse, watching the first fat raindrops splatter against the sidewalk. Perfect timing, I thought, remembering Victor's hidden message that only appeared in water. Some things are meant to be seen wet. Elaine answered the door in a cloud of expensive perfume and practiced sympathy. "Maya, darling, come in out of this awful weather. I was just telling Robert how concerned we all are about your situation." Robert Morrison turned out to be exactly what Central Casting would order for sleazy developer. Silver hair, expensive suit, smile that never reached his eyes, and a handshake that lingered just a moment too long. The kind of man who called women sweetheart and thought it was charming instead of condescending. "Maya, I've heard so much about you. Your brothers tell me you've inherited some challenging property up in Greene County. I specialize in finding creative solutions for exactly those kinds of situations." "That's very kind of you," I said, letting my voice carry just the right note of overwhelmed gratitude. "I have to admit I'm pretty lost when it comes to real estate." Daniel appeared with drinks, his lawyer face already in place. "Maya, before we eat, maybe we should show Robert those property documents, get his professional opinion on your options." "Actually," I said, glancing toward windows where rain was beginning to streak down in earnest, "I was hoping we could all drive up to see the property first. I think it's something that needs to be experienced in person." Elaine frowned. "In this weather? Maya, it's starting to pour." "I know it sounds strange, but Victor always said some things are meant to be seen wet. And since Mr. Morrison specializes in challenging properties,
I thought he should see exactly what kind of challenge we're dealing with. Eric exchanged a look with Daniel. Maya, you don't need to put yourself through that. We can handle the practical aspects. No, I said, more firmly than they'd probably ever heard me speak. If we're going to discuss my inheritance, we're going to do it where it belongs. All of us. Together. There was something in my tone that made them pause. Robert Morrison smiled his practiced smile. I think that's an excellent idea. Due diligence is always important with rural properties. An hour later, we were all standing in the cemetery as the November storm reached its full strength. I'd insisted we park at the gates and walk, despite the protests about ruined shoes and expensive suits. I wanted them to feel every step of this journey, to understand that this wasn't just about property values and development potential. Jesus, Maya, Eric muttered, rain streaming down his face as we approached my grandfather's monument. This place is even more depressing than I remembered. It has potential, though, Morrison said, already looking past the headstones toward the valley beyond. Great bones, excellent access. Once you clear out the existing features, this could be prime residential or commercial development. Clear out the existing features, as if the graves were just inconvenient furniture that could be moved to make room for something more profitable. We gathered around my grandfather's black marble headstone, rain sheeting across its polished surface. In the gray light, it looked like a dark mirror reflecting storm clouds. "This is beautiful work," Morrison said, running his hand across the stone. "Real craftsmanship. Shame it's in such an isolated location." "Actually," I said, "location is exactly what makes it special. Look." I moved to the back of the monument and waited. In the heavy rain, the hidden characters began to emerge like magic, Victor's careful message blooming across the wet marble in delicate lines of light. Daniel stepped closer, squinting through his rain-spotted glasses. "What the—" "For the daughter who sees what others miss, 10 paces north from this stone, under the big stone that stands alone, when you're ready to know the truth about where you come from." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain on leaves and the distant thunder. 4 faces stared at me through the downpour. Confusion, calculation, and the first glimmers of something that might have been concern. "Maya, what are you talking about?" Elaine said carefully. I pulled the waterproof envelope from my jacket and handed Daniel the adoption papers, the death certificates, the insurance documents. Everything that proved what Victor had hidden for 29 years. "I'm talking about the fact that I'm not your sister," I said, watching his face change as he read. "I'm not Victor's daughter. I'm his niece, Emma Chen's daughter, orphaned at 6 months old, raised by a man whose guilt over his sister's death shaped every decision he made about my life." Eric grabbed the papers from Daniel's hands, his surgeon's precision replaced by something closer to panic. "This is impossible. Dad never, he never said." "Of course he didn't, because he was protecting me, just like he protected this place, just like he protected the truth about what I really inherited." Morrison was looking between the papers and the monument, his developer's mind already calculating angles. "This is very touching, but it doesn't change the fundamental situation. You still have property that's expensive to maintain and difficult to monetize." "Actually," I said, pulling out the property deeds from the vault, watching his expression change as he scanned the list of parcels, "it changes everything." The rain intensified as I explained about the 20 surrounding properties, the water rights, the strategic control over development access. I watched his face shift from predatory confidence to genuine surprise and something that looked almost like respect. "You own the entire watershed," he said finally. "Every access road, every buildable ridgeline. This isn't just a cemetery. It's the center of a 2,000-acre empire."
Worth how much? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, mental calculations running behind his eyes. Conservatively, 60 to 70 million, more if you're willing to develop aggressively. The numbers hung in the rain-soaked air like a challenge. 60 to 70 million? More than Daniel's Manhattan Tower? More than Eric's medical complex? More than both their inheritances combined? But Maya, Elaine said desperately, you can't possibly manage all this alone. You don't have the experience, the business knowledge. You're right. I don't have experience running a real estate empire. But I have something else Victor wanted me to have, the power to decide what happens to the place where my mother is buried, where my grandfather rests, where my family's real story lives. I looked around at their faces, Daniel calculating legal angles, Eric processing the magnitude of his miscalculation, Elaine realizing her stepchild had just become the wealthiest person in the family, Morrison recalibrating his entire approach. The question now, I said, rain streaming down my face like tears of joy, is what I'm going to do with that power, and whether any of you are going to be part of that decision. Thunder rolled across the valley, and in that moment, standing in the storm beside my grandfather's monument, with the truth finally flowing between us like water, I understood why Victor had waited until I was ready. This wasn't just about money or property or family dynamics. This was about justice, finally served, cold and wet, and absolutely perfect.
Chapter 7. Justice Without a Shout. The drive back to the city was silent, except for the rain drumming against the windshield and the soft hum of the car's heater working overtime. Daniel had offered to drive, a telling gesture from a man who usually let other people handle the small details, but I declined. I needed the control, needed to feel my hands on the wheel and my foot on the gas as we left the cemetery behind. Morrison had excused himself almost immediately after the revelation, mumbling something about other appointments and promising to be in touch about potential opportunities. I'd watched him practically sprint through the rain to his expensive sedan, and I couldn't help but smile. He'd come expecting to exploit a desperate woman with worthless property, and instead he'd found someone who could buy and sell him without breaking a sweat. Now my brothers and Elaine sat in my car like children who'd been caught stealing cookies, their earlier confidence replaced by something between embarrassment and calculation. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to salvage this situation, how to position themselves advantageously now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. It was Eric who finally broke the silence as we reached the city limits. Eric, I want you to know that we really were just trying to help. We had no idea about all of this. I know, and I meant it. That's exactly the problem. Daniel shifted in the passenger seat. What do you mean? I mean that for 29 years, none of you bothered to really see me. You saw the youngest daughter, the one who didn't go into law or medicine, the one who chose writing over building empires. You saw someone who needed to be managed, guided, rescued from her own poor judgment. I navigated through the evening traffic, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked windows. Even when Dad died, even when you saw what he left me, your first instinct wasn't to ask what it meant or why he might have made that choice. It was to figure out how to fix my problem for me. Elaine's voice came from the back seat, smaller than usual. We thought we were being supportive. You thought you were being smart, I corrected gently. And maybe you were, from your perspective. A cemetery with maintenance costs versus Manhattan real estate. Of course it looked like Dad had made a mistake or played favorites or just run out of valuable assets by the time he got to me. We stopped at a red light, and I turned to look at Daniel. When was the last time you asked me about my work, about what stories I'm investigating, what I've learned, what I think about the world? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The answer was obvious to both of us. When was the last time any of you treated me like someone whose opinions mattered,
whose judgment you trusted, whose life had value beyond what you could fix for me. The light turned green, and I pressed on through the darkening city. I'm not angry, I said, and realized with some surprise that it was true. Not anymore. I was for a while. Angry that Dad kept this secret. Angry that you all assumed I needed rescuing. Angry that I had spent so many years feeling like I wasn't enough. But sitting in that vault, reading Dad's letters, I understood something I'd never seen before. What? Asked Eric. That the problem was never me. The problem was that Dad was so afraid to hurt me with the truth that he let me hurt myself with lies. And the problem was that you all cared so much about being good siblings that you never bothered to find out who I actually was. I pulled into the parking garage beneath Daniel's building and turned off the engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear the rain still pattering against the concrete above us. So, here's what's going to happen, I said, turning to face them all. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a lawyer, not you, Daniel, someone who doesn't have a personal stake in this, and I'm setting up a foundation, the Emma and Robert Chin Foundation for Traffic Safety and Rural Emergency Services. Maya, I'm not finished. My voice carried an authority I'd never heard from myself before. The foundation will receive the deed to the cemetery and enough of the surrounding property to ensure it's protected forever. No development, no commercial use, just a quiet place where people can rest. I pulled the property deeds from my jacket and spread them across the dashboard. The remaining parcels will fund the foundation's work, scholarships for families affected by traffic accidents, rural emergency response training, road safety initiatives, real work that makes a difference. That's beautiful, Maya, Elaine said softly. But what about you? What about your future, your security? I'll keep enough to be comfortable. More than enough, actually. But the rest belongs to something bigger than any of us. And us? Eric asked quietly. What about us? I looked at my brothers, these men who had shared my childhood, my father's dinner table, my last name, and felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, because that implied they'd wronged me deliberately. More like understanding. I'd like to offer you positions on the foundation board. Daniel will need legal expertise to navigate the regulations and ensure we're making real impact. Eric, rural emergency medicine is exactly the kind of specialized knowledge we'll need. Daniel blinked. You want us to work for you? I want us to work together for the first time in our lives. Paid positions, but modest ones, and completely transparent. Public salary information, audited books, board meetings anyone can attend. No empire building, Eric said, understanding immediately. No empire building, I confirmed. Just good work, done honestly, in memory of people who deserved better than they got. We sat there in the dim parking garage, rain echoing above us, while they absorbed what I was offering. Not revenge, despite having every right to it. Not exclusion, despite their assumptions about my worth. Just the chance to be part of something meaningful, something that honored the complicated legacy Dad had left us all. There's one condition, I said finally. Mr. Hahn stays on as groundskeeper. He's been protecting that place longer than any of us have been alive, and he deserves to see it properly cared for. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I think I'd like that. The foundation work, I mean. It's been a long time since I used my law degree for something that wasn't about money. Me too, Eric said. And Maya, I'm sorry for not seeing you, for not asking, for assuming you needed saving instead of listening. Elaine reached forward and squeezed my shoulder. Your father would be proud, not just of what you're doing with the inheritance, but who you are, who you've always been. I sat there feeling the weight of her words, the warmth of genuine understanding finally passing between us. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, and through the Promarby entrance, I could see the first stars appearing between the clouds. For the first time in my life, I felt like exactly where I belonged.
Chapter 8. The Stone That Stays. 6 months later, I stood in the same spot,
where I'd first discovered Victor's hidden message. But everything had changed. The cemetery paths were no longer choked with weeds. Mr. Hahn had worked tirelessly through the spring, clearing decades of overgrowth while carefully preserving the wild beauty that made this place feel like sanctuary rather than graveyard. The Emma and Robert Chen Foundation had been officially established for 3 months now, operating out of a small office in the nearby town of Millbrook. Daniel spent 2 days a week there, handling legal compliance and grant applications with an enthusiasm I'd never seen him bring to corporate law. Eric had started a rural emergency medicine training program that was already drawing paramedics and volunteer firefighters from across the region. But it was the changes I couldn't see that mattered most. The way Daniel actually listened when I talked about foundation business, the way Eric asked about my writing projects and remembered the details from one conversation to the next, the way Elaine had started sending me newspaper clippings about traffic safety initiatives in other states, with little notes about how we might adapt them for our work. Today was the official dedication ceremony for the protected cemetery grounds. We'd invited the entire county, all the families with relatives buried here, the local officials who'd helped us navigate the preservation process, the donors and volunteers who'd already started supporting our work. About 50 people had come, despite the threatening clouds that hung low over the valley. Miss Maya, Mr. Hahn appeared beside me, holding a wooden crate with white lily bulbs. These came in yesterday from the nursery in Albany. They said white lilies symbolize renewal and peace. They're perfect, I said, taking one of the bulbs and feeling its weight in my palm. Where should we plant them? I was thinking around your mother's grave, he said quietly, and your father's. They're right here, together, where they belong. It had taken me 3 months to work up the courage to order proper headstones for Emma and Robert Chen, to replace the simple granite marker with something that told their story properly. The new stones were modest, nothing like my grandfather's dramatic monument, but they bore inscriptions that honored who they'd been, not just when they lived and died. Emma Chen Lin, beloved daughter, devoted mother, keeper of dreams. Robert Chen, gentle soul, loving father, builder of hope. As we knelt together to plant the lily bulbs around their graves, I found myself thinking about the strange mathematics of family, how love multiplies when you think it should divide, how secrets kept to protect hurt more than truths shared to heal, how the hardest thing sometimes is believing you deserve the good things that come your way. You know, I said to Mr. Hahn as we worked, Victor spent 29 years trying to make up for something that was never his fault. My parents' accident, the insurance money, raising me, none of that was a debt he owed. It was just love, complicated by guilt. Mr. Hahn nodded, patting soil around a bulb with gentle precision. Your father understood that near the end. He told me once that he'd finally realized the best way to honor his sister wasn't to carry guilt about her death, but to celebrate what she'd given him. You. The dedication ceremony began at 2:00, just as the first drops of rain started to fall. Perfect timing, I thought, remembering everything that rain had revealed to me in this place. County officials spoke about the importance of preserving local history. Daniel gave a brief presentation about the foundation's mission. Eric talked about the emergency training programs and how they might prevent other families from experiencing what mine had. But it was when I stepped up to speak that the rain began in earnest, that familiar Greene County downpour that turned the world soft and reflective. I looked out at the faces gathered under umbrellas and makeshift canopies, neighbors I was still getting to know, volunteers who'd already become friends, family members who were finally becoming themselves with me. 6 months ago, I said, I inherited what I thought was a burden, a cemetery I couldn't afford to maintain, a responsibility I wasn't prepared for, a reminder of loss that felt more like punishment than gift. The rain intensified, and I found myself thinking of that first day, standing here confused and hurt, believing I'd been forgotten in my father's final accounting of worth. What I actually inherited was a story. The story of two young people whose lives were cut short, but whose love created something lasting. The story of a man who spent 3 decades carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. The story of a family that forgot how to see each other clearly because we were all so afraid of being seen ourselves. I walked over to my grandfather's monument, where the rain was already beginning to work its magic on the hidden inscription. The familiar words emerged like a blessing. For the daughter who sees what others miss. The most precious thing Victor left me wasn't property or money. It was the knowledge that I was never the child who didn't matter. I was the child he trusted most. Trusted to understand what family really means. Trusted to know the difference between wealth and worth. Trusted to choose love over profit when it mattered most. The rain was coming down hard now, turning discernibly into something spontaneous and joyful. Children splashed in puddles while their parents laughed and gave up trying to stay dry. Mr. Hahn stood near the lily plantings, watching the water soak into the soil around the new bulbs, a smile creasing his weathered face. This place will be here long after all of us are gone, not because we fought to preserve it, but because we chose to honor what it represents. The idea that some things are more valuable than what they can be sold for, that some stories are more important than the profit they might generate. As the ceremony ended and people began to drift toward their cars, I found myself alone again. Beside my grandfather's monument, the hidden inscription glowed clearly in the rain. Victor's love letter to the daughter he'd been too afraid to claim, but too devoted to abandon. I thought about the little girl who used to count raindrops on windows, who found comfort in quiet places, who always felt like she was watching life from the outside. That girl was right about one thing. She was different from the rest of her family, but different didn't mean less. Different meant chosen for something specific, something that required exactly the combination of stubbornness and gentleness, curiosity and compassion that made her who she was. The rain slowed to a gentle patter, and in the growing quiet, I spoke my mother's name aloud for the first time. Emma Chin Lin. Then my father's, Robert Chin. Finally, looking up at the clearing sky, thank you for giving me to someone who loved me enough to keep your story alive. Walking back to my car, I passed the freshly planted lily beds where Mr. Hahn had said new growth would emerge in spring. By then, This place would be fully established as protected land, and the foundation would be funding its first round of scholarships for children who'd lost parents in traffic accidents. I wasn't the overlooked daughter, or the rescued one, or the grateful one. I was simply Maya, keeper of stories, protector of quiet places, daughter of love that refused to be buried even when it was complicated by loss. As I drove home through the clearing afternoon, I realized I was finally living the life that had been waiting for me all along.
Thank you for joining us on Maya's extraordinary journey of discovery and transformation. Her story reminds us that sometimes what looks like rejection is actually protection, and that the most valuable gifts often come disguised as burdens. Maya's path from forgotten daughter to empowered keeper of family legacy shows us that our worth isn't determined by how others see us. It's defined by how we choose to honor the truth when we finally find it. Until next time, remember, you are more cherished than you know, stronger than you believe, and worthy of every good thing that comes your way. Just like Maya, you have the power to transform what seems like loss into something beautiful. How did you find today's story? Please let us know in the comments where you are right now and what you're doing while listening to this. Are you at home with a warm cup of tea, taking an evening walk, or perhaps keeping someone company during a quiet moment? We're curious about your stories too, and we love hearing how these tales touch your lives. And if Maya's story moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the most precious inheritances aren't measured in dollars, or inspired you to look deeper when life seems unfair, please give us a like and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Perhaps someone who's ever felt overlooked, or anyone who would appreciate being reminded that love often works in mysterious ways. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of family, forgiveness, and finding your true place in the world. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today. And may you always remember that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for someone with eyes wise enough to see their true value.